Minority Groups in U.S. Society, pages 486 through 497. Covering today, we'll be covering the big names in history for minority groups. Why is substance technology important? How does contact situation, group competition, and power shape our society? Importance of intersectionality. How has assimilation and pluralism affected the minority groups? Minority group progress. The history of important voices and movements for the minority. In 1955, Rosa Parks was asked to give up her seat to a white man in the black part of the bus. She retaliated and would not give up her seat. This resulted in her getting arrested. She went through her court case and fought for her rights with pride. This gave many people, especially women, confidence to fight for their rights as well. Also in 1955 is when Daughter of Bilitis was founded. This is the first lesbian political rights organization. In 1960 was the first U.S. public gathering of lesbians. Also in 1960, 4 black students in Greensboro, North Carolina sat and ate lunch at a segregated lunch hall. This act is what started black Americans to start nonviolent protests to prove they belonged to and meant no harm. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech inspiring millions. In 1965, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, sorry if I mispronounced, found the United Farm Workers Association. This helped farmers get better pay to be able to sell their crops and have better working conditions. In 1968, the American Indian Movement and Advocacy Group is founded. In 1969, the patrons of the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village riot happened. This riot was started because police officers charged in on the gay bar called Stonewall Inn. In 1972, the American Indian Movement sponsored the Trail of Broken Treaties. The Trail of Broken Treaties was a cross-country protest by the American Indians for their rights to be pushed. In 1987, the National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights drew over 500,000 people, making it the largest civil rights demonstration in U.S. history. In 1995, the Million Man March was held in Washington, D.C. to put black issues back on the nation's political agenda. In 2004, Hispanic Americans became the largest minority group. In 2008, undocumented immigrants declined due to economic hard times. The immigrant number fell to less than 11 million in 2012. In 2012, Asians surpassed Hispanics as the largest group of new immigrants in the U.S. I mention all of these brave acts and all of these brave people because not only did they create a voice for themselves and for people that were suffering, they helped pave paths for a better and accepting world. We still have a long way to go, but these people made a start and deserve to be recognized for years to come. To understand the evolution of Americans' minority group is to understand the history of the United States. Sorry, I have trouble pronouncing this word, but bear with me. Subsistence technology is about understanding multiple views. Fear was the problem. Fear creates violence and an unacceptance from people that look different from the dominant group and have different beliefs. Not understanding someone does not give you the right to try and change them. When you do not understand something, you ask and try to understand. That is why subsistence technology is so important. Subsistence technology is so important because it is the most basic force shaping a society and helping form relationships between dominant and minority groups. As the new technology of the Industrial Revolution increased the productivity of the economy and changed every aspect of life in the United States, this ended the agrarian era. The agrarian era was an era of using minority groups that had no power and no resources compared to dominant groups as slaves, and used minority groups to do the dirty work for the dominant group's benefits. When the new technologies came about, there were more efficient and faster ways to do things, and some of these minority groups were not needed. Once the technologies flourished, this gave new light to the Americas, causing more immigrants of different backgrounds to come to the states, making America more diverse. Although many Europeans benefited from the continued industrialization, they also took it over, and immigrants from Asia and Latin America were not so lucky. As the Europeans flourished, the Chinese and Japanese Americans survived in the ethnic enclave of the mainstream of society, and the Mexican Americans as well as the Puerto Ricans supplied low-paid manual labor for both the rural and the urban economy. This caused Asian and Hispanic Americans to be barred from the higher paid jobs and little to no access to dominant group institutions, although they were all qualified and would have flourished and done our economy good. This caused European Americans to move up in the occupational structure, and at this time, manual, unskilled jobs that were supporting African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans were dwindling. As the Europeans were growing in wealth, the minority groups were confronted by urban poverty and bankrupt cities. As you can see to the left is a picture of some of the faces that contributed to America's diversity. Contact situation, group competition, and power. As we have discussed in other chapters, the importance of contact situation when the dominant groups and minority groups first come into contact with each other. Contact situation, group competition, and power are the three things that have shaped America today and are important to continue shaping the U.S. If the three conditions, ethnocentrism, competition, and differential power, are present in the contrast situation, ethnic or racial stratification will result. These instances have oppressed and tried to get rid of minority groups by making it harder and harder to gain access to the states and to gain citizenship from the U.S. We need group competition to grow and to surpass one another with greatness. Competition pushes us to find more and do more, pushes us to fight, which is what matters. Many positive changes we have discussed in all the chapters were the result of a minority group activism and protest group competition and power. Then we need power. Everyone wants power and strives to have power. If everyone were equal, we would not have competition to gain power and everything would stay the same. Although sometimes power is used wrongly, that pushes the people that it was used wrongly against to compete and do something about it. Importance of intersectionality. Although you have minority groups, they still differ. Usually only one thing brings them together, maybe the color of their skin or what they believe, but they are all different from each other. That is what makes us human. We differ by age, sex, region of residence, level of education, urban versus rural residence, political ideology, and many other variables make even those that occupy minority groups different from one another. When looking on page 491 in the textbook, it talks about how in minority groups the biggest study is between men and women, but these studies have mainly focused on men and the experiences of minority women have not been targeted near as much. Women have less access to power and leadership roles than men in both dominant groups and minority groups. Thus, women usually have subordinate statuses even in their own groups. This is where the importance of intersectionality comes into play. Not only do you need to compare women to men, you need to compare dominant group women to minority group women as well as all those experiences versus men and women in both dominant and minority groups. Once you look at a group with an intersectionality approach, this will help you try to see from all sides of view. That way, when you fight for rights, you fight for the lowest and the highest level of people, because all people are treated with inequality deserve to be heard. This will shape the relative success of the movement for many cases domestically and globally. Once you start visiting the difference between many groups and researching intersectionality within that group, it opens up even more research into how it compares to many aspects of life and what sex you are, or what you believe plays into how you get treated by both your own groups and the opposite groups that you're competing with. Assimilation and pluralism. As we discussed in my slides above, many people want power for their people and themselves. But what are these minority groups being made to do to gain any form of power? Assimilate. The dominant groups fear difference, And if you show you are not different from the dominant group and assimilate to their ways, you will not get ridiculed as much, but you have to lose your culture and what you made you to do so. Smaller Hispanic groups consist mostly of new immigrants that are just starting the assimilation process, being made to change to fit the dominant group. Some people change willingly to get what they want and need to survive and become successful, and others try hard to hold on to their culture and heritage, but sadly, there is usually eventually some change. As we have discussed before in class, the more and more minority groups assimilate to American society to the ways of the dominant groups, the more distant their culture will become with each generation born. If we do not accept cultures that came from these minority groups, the diverse America we know today may not be as dominant in the future. To learn and cherish our ancestors that came before us, we need to keep their culture alive. It would be easier if this were a pluralistic culture, where differences in the way people lived were accepted. Minority group progress. Coming from recent years, we know there is progress that has been made, but not enough. As we have spoke in a discussion in class, if we only look at how much progress we have made, we could get comfortable and stay where we are. And where we are is still not good enough for some of these minority groups. Evidence of progress is easy to find for some groups because of how low they started. For some groups, any small leap looks like a huge one to people that do not live the way they impoverished minority groups do. With all this being said, we have made huge strides for women holding powerful positions, the election of President Barack Obama, and some minority group members are being found more and more at highest levels of success. I point all these strides out to show two things. One, sadly, these are huge strides that should have already been implemented, because if we treat everyone as human and not by how they look or what they believe, these would not be strides that were made by people who suffered before us, but normalcy. Two, I point these out to say yes, these are huge strides, but we need to make it so these kinds of things are normal in our society. Dominant groups in our society have given minority groups trial after trial, and they still are rising and benefiting themselves. That is the true progress for these minority groups. The fact dominant groups have tried to destroy them, and they come out stronger. Questions. So, are you part of a minority group, and if so, what is your group and how has it affected you being part of that group? Also, how has it affected you and your family? What are some big names that you feel have paved a path for success for your group and how? What is the one thing you think we could implement to help a minority group strive and become more efficient in our society?